Hola, cage fighting connoisseurs. This is Kid Nate of Bloody Elbow, joined by John Nash, also of Bloody Elbow, to tell you a little bit about something we've already dropped, but we'll be dropping more of: Pan Chronicles, the secret story of mixed martial arts. John, how do we end up with such a terrible name for our pet project?
100% your fault. I fought and fought, but we had other names, many other names, but a guy who I will not name, even though I like the guy, I'm still holding a grudge. He holds the trademark on every
trademark, the term history of MMA history.
Basically every variable of every name that we wanted to use for a while. So
yes.
So you came up with the genius idea. Why don't we take Pankration, which everybody's familiar with, and Chronicles, which everybody knows the meaning of, and instead of calling it Pankration Chronicles, just shorten it to Pan Chronicles.
I knew that Pan Chronicles would not be trademarked. That was really
that was a good leap of faith on that one. Yeah, I'm pretty positive this one's not covered.
Vox Media lawyers confirmed that it's not. So this dropped about a month ago, the first episode, which covers the Royce Gracie side of pre-UFC 1. We had to start with UFC 1. Now, we know that's not really where MMA history starts. Excuse me, the story of MMA starts. But that's a logical starting point because that is where modern MMA as a commercial prospect started.
Yes. That's I'm trying to think of a parallel. That's the in boxing, what is that? That's, I guess, not the Queen of Marquee rules. I guess that's Sullivan. I mean, at UFC 1 is Jack Sullivan getting the title. And from that point, or even when he put on gloves, from that point on, boxing, everybody follows boxing from Sullivan on. Before it's in a mist, and people may or may not have heard about
because boxing was frequently illegal before Big Jim Sullivan. So
it was frequently illegal after Sullivan. But
yes,
but period, it was almost banned from the whole country shortly.
Yes,
Sullivan was on trains going across states to try to find a spot to have a match.
It sounds awfully familiar, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's a lot of there's a lot of parallels. I can remember loading up in Buffalo to go to Alabama or something like that. That was famous. I can't remember what sport did that, but some sport did that in the middle of the night.
That would be the UFC, the sport of UFC.
Yeah. So, but I think we're starting off with UFC 1. That's our foundation basically, and I guess the concept is.
The concept is to tell the story of the fighters and their fighting styles and the way they evolved together. Like you had Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. What is this? Where did it come from? Why was it so effective in the cage? Also, shoot fighting. What was shoot fighting? Well, it's catch wrestling. It's just the Japanese version of catch wrestling. We'll talk about what I think is a really fascinating story of how the Japanese got so fascinated with real professional wrestling, and not quotes, but actual real professional wrestling, and the submission holds involved in old school catch wrestling, and evolved their pro wrestling, pro resu, into proto MMA through groups like Shudo, Pancrase, Rings. There was a bunch of them, and a whole spectrum.
Even just the previous Inoki and all this stuff he was doing, and just even a lot of the strong style, which was still fake. It was done so realistic that people were having a hard time distinguishing what was a real. And I mean, there's still matches from the 80s that are put on the internet, and people claim those are real shoot matches.
Well, because frequently the sort of script, the plot outline would be like, we know who's going to win. You're going to win, and you're going to use this move, but take 15 minutes to get there, and they would really basically fight up till the predetermined conclusion.
Yeah, there might be a few. You just don't break the guy's arm when you put on the hammerlock. That was basically the rule. When you put it on, don't really do it, but make it look good. But which is interesting because it's a throwback to the old 1910s pro wrestling, where which may or may not be real. There's still quite. I mean, there's some I think was real, some not, but that was the whole purpose back then. We're fixing matches. We don't want you to know until later. Let's add a double drop kick. Boy, that's a realistic move. But
well, nothing's perfect. But
if you don't like pro wrestling, for those MMA fans that hate pro wrestling, I'm going to warn you. There's going to be some pro wrestling because you can't get around it. And we're not even talking about the Ken Shamrock Pancrase side. The Gracie side, you guys probably don't want to hear this too. That comes from pro wrestling.
Yes, and we'll talk about. And to me, one of the most fascinating things is the way modern MMA is basically the collision stylistically of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and Japanese catch wrestling. But ironically, Japanese catch wrestling came from American and British fighting styles, catch wrestling. And Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, it's in the name, came from Japan. And it came by way of a professional wrestler who...
And interesting enough is that they also, their rule forms of Vale Tudo and fake pro wrestling rules that are basically both like MMA came out of the fights when Japanese judo took on American catch wrestling. And they staged these all-in fights and they split up again, came back again. So really, this has been going on. People want to know the history of MMA. It started over 100 years ago. That's the start of modern MMA.
Yeah, and so we want to talk through all this stuff. And what makes this a little different for us is that we licensed Susumu Nagao's photographs. We don't have access to the film rights. Sorry, that's UFC for you. But we do have original photos and illustrators and animation. So we're trying to do something a bit more involved, which is why we're talking about it and telling you folks about it, because if you care about this stuff, we need your support to share it and talk about it and retweet it and upvote it on YouTube and share it on Facebook and tell people about it, because we're not going to make the whole series unless people are excited about it. We've got the first episode out. It did okay, and we'll keep pushing it, but we want more interest. We need more interest if you want to hear this story. And like, this basically is something that I blogged. This is the first thing where I blogged that I was actually proud of, which was a series I did, I don't know, 10 years ago, 20-part series of the history of MMA, and not all the John McCain human cockfighting bullshit that everybody talks about. I'm not interested in the history of the business, except as it's incidental to the history of the fighting and the fighting styles. So we're going to, in that series, I talked about, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and their Brazilian rivals, Luta Livre, and how that evolved out of catch wrestling and judo as well. And there's a whole economic cast thing. And we talk about Rickson Gracie going to Japan and fighting in the early Shudo events. It wasn't Shudo, it was International Vale Tudo was the name of the event, right?
I think Vale Tudo Japan, wasn't it?
Vale Tudo Japan, and it would happen once a year. and Rickson became a much bigger deal in Japan than he ever became in the U.S. because he was on national.
He was the original. I'm sorry to interrupt, but the whole Pride is basically based on the idea that Rickson's going to fight one of their biggest pro wrestling stars. Pride is built on that concept.
Yes, and they never could get Rickson.
Shows you how clueless I was for a long time with the Pro Wrestling Connection. I watched Krokop knock a guy out in Japan wearing a mask, a luchador mask, and I still had no clue that there was that they were basically doing pro wrestling for real for like a year after that. It took me 2 more years of watching Pride before it finally hit me. You know what? I think this is pro wrestling.
And yet that was the most brilliant MMA promotion ever. Yeah. And we'll also talk about one of the things that really fascinates me is the whole international flavor of mixed martial arts and the various countries that got involved and were represented, like Holland, which is a tiny country that you wouldn't necessarily expect to be making a big impact on an international sport. But because of people like Bas Rutten and a whole bunch of dudes. Do you remember any of the rings, guys? Come on, drop some science.
Volkan.
Volkan, yes, yeah, the great Volkan.
But again, Volkan gives you a different connection, the Russian connection.
Yes.
So we have Russian and Sambo and all their martial arts they're bringing in, and then you got then we can put in and we're too MMA. Muay Thai was known before, but Muay Thai has become a massive martial art thanks to MMA.
Yeah, because people figured out pretty quickly that was the striking style that had the most direct impact on that worked the best in early MMA. Karate. Yeah,
our age group, people younger now don't realize, but our age group will remember how Muay Thai was not. There wasn't a Muay Thai gym anywhere in the country, basically. By early 2000s, they're everywhere.
Yeah, it was completely unknown, and so we want to talk about that stuff, and we want to tell the story in a souped-up way. So the first episode, which is already out, talks about what's it talk about, John?
Well, I guess the first episode is the setup of the first UFC, how it's put together by the Gracies and Davis as a promotional event, as a spectacle to make money, but also for the Gracie family to advertise their Gracie Jiu-Jitsu. And then we go back a little bit and explain where Gracie Jiu-Jitsu came and how it led to this. The second episode is going to finish that story of UFC 1, where we talk about the other side that made a big impact at UFC 1 and had a huge impact on the rest of mixed martial arts. That's Ken Shamrock and being adopted by Bob Shamrock, but also being adopted in pro wrestling by Funaki and brought into the shoot style, the real life pro wrestling of Japan.
Yes, and I think it's a little unfortunate. It's always bugged me that neither Funaki or Suzuki came over and fought in the UFC, but they had their own thing in Japan, and basically until long after Pride collapsed, there was no incentive for Japanese fighters to come to America to fight. I mean, they would make more money in Japan, be big stars, and fight on their home turf. But nonetheless, Shamrock was a very able representative of that style. Mm-hmm. And the way it played out was that Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu was just a little bit ahead of catch wrestling because they'd had more time to hone their style in no-rules matches. And so then we'll talk about the Vale Tudo in Japan. Are we skipping? We're not doing a piece on the Luta Livre rivalry?
Oh, I think we are. We have a piece on there, I think, don't we?
I don't know. It's like episode 3 is going to be, look back into the whole, yes, we are hybrid wrestlers, and talk about where Shamrock came from. Then we'll talk about Vale Tudo Japan and Hickson's trip over there. Then we'll talk about sort of the end of the first era of the UFC when Royce Gracie and Kim Shamrock put on the first boring match in UFC history, or the most boring match up to that point.
I think this is because we have seasons planned, people. So if we don't get a million viewers, it's your fault that we do not continue going to. But the Luta Livre, the Brazilian rivalry, I think that actually was the plan for the start of the second season, because I think it was at that year there was the big Brazilian event.
Yes,
and turned into riots. We were waiting. We had a lot. It's very complex, people. This is all my experience in Hollywood as a storyteller being brought to bear here.
Yes, many an infomercial and softcore porn movie. The expertise is going to come.
Yeah, for years I've been dreaming to make it to hardcore, and I was stuck at softcore. I could never get out of it.
I thought it was the other way around. I thought it was the hardcore actors were trying to prove they could act.
It's always I won't get those stories. Okay. Let's stay focused, people.
Yeah. So the first season, though, episode 6, we'll then talk about Extreme Fighting Championship, which was John Peretti's promotion, which was a huge step forward. It's the first place you see mandatory gloves. It's got weight classes, and it's the first place we see Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu lose in the modern era.
It's either a huge step forward or a huge step backwards, depending on your point of view.
Well, I mean, if you're the Gracie family, maybe it was a big step back. But Igor Zinoviev's win over Mario Sperry was epochal. I mean, that was a huge shift in the whole dynamic of mixed martial arts, because every jiu-jitsu fighter in the world thought, I'm just going to go in here and roll these clowns. And then Igor Zinoviev comes along with his combat sambo training and says, no, you're not. Or as he, yet, I believe.
Yes, I think that's the technical.
Yeah. And then we talk about the episode 7. We're going to talk about the second wave of UFC stars like Tank Abbott, Don Fry, Gary Goodridge, all those guys, and where their fighting styles come from. In the case of Tank Abbott, it's like half-ass high school wrestling, a whole lot of parking lot brawler.
Yeah. I think Tank Abbott was the first guy that shows that for one of the templates of a good MMA fighter is just being really tough with some basic skills to get past, and then really tough. And you can actually go someplace in the sport.
Oh, yeah. If you can hit like that and do a basic sprawl, I mean, that was essentially Tank's entire repertoire.
Yeah, I remember watching Tank in the 90s, and he was one of the reasons I hated MMA.
See, I loved hating Tank at the time because I was a huge Royce Gracie fan. The whole thing about the Gracies was like, oh my God, a little runt like me could actually learn through hard work and application how to defend myself and even overcome giant, big, strong, coordinated, athletic goons.
Yeah, I got to be honest, people. I was one of those guys that hated MMA in the 90s. I was clutching my pearls, yes.
Was it pride that converted you over?
It was what converted me over. Actually, was I did a movie in 2002 with Frank Shamrock and Randy Couture. Now I still can't pronounce his name ever since I started studying French, and Sam Spira rips on me about that. But anyway, I did a movie with those guys. I used to think MMA was just, even though I watched several events, I thought, man, God, these guys got to be idiots. The movie didn't help because it was all about big wheel trucks with giant wheels, blaring crappy rap rock with women in t-shirts and affliction shirts everywhere. So the movie didn't help. But I ended up talking to some MMA guys, some fighters, and holy shit, you guys are really smart. This is interesting. You explained it as a human chess. And I was been in martial arts for years. So then I started giving it another chance. I started watching it. And I go, holy shit, that was wrong.
So had you actually watched the full event before that point?
I'd been to a few parties and rolled my eyes because I was big into boxing. I thought, oh, these guys will get killed by,
a real
Vander Holyfield would just mark these guys up. And he might have. Some of those guys were terrible.
Well, yeah. I mean, I think Fred Edish would have been,
yeah. But then but I did see a few. I probably saw 5 events in the 90s. So
yeah, and then we'll talk about pro wrestling and go back deep dive into where Pankronicles came from, Shudo rings, and Antonio Inoki and his whole fascination with doing worked matches, but with athletes from other combat sports. Like he not only did Muhammad Ali, which was not a worked match, although it was a complete fiasco, but he fought Olympic medal judokas, Olympic amateur wrestlers, karate experts, all kinds of stuff. And this whole fascination of how would different fighting styles fare against each other first begins to be expressed there, or in a big commercial way is expressed in a really sustained way that really impacted the imagination of a whole generation of Japanese wrestlers.
Yeah, he's interesting too because he had a lot of he had actual shoot matches too. Besides those were staged, but there was matches at Inoki. Even though he's not the greatest technical wrestler, I mean that's his gimmick, but he's not that. But he's fascinating because he also represents the idea of how they had to keep it so real that there's several of his matches you can probably find on YouTube where they turn into shoots. He has a match where he goes to Pakistan and takes on a Pakistan wrestler, and at some point something goes wrong and you can tell it turns into a shoot, and he ends up putting the guy in a double wrist lock and dislocating his shoulder to get the win. So
lessons had to be taught. And so then
yes. Oh, that's the old school pro wrestling.
Yes. And then after that, we're going to talk about the Russian impact on the sport, and that's where Volkan comes in. We're still blanking on the guy, the original Dutchman in rings, but it was Akira Maeda that went to Holland and found a bunch of Dutch fighters that he brought over, and that even though rings was a work, it was really close to being a shoot. Oh, yeah. And ultimately would do some shoot fights. I mean,
some people were involved in couple of famous tournaments out of there.
Yes, yeah. And that'll be probably in the second or third series, and then we'll cap the first season with episode 10. The lights go out, where we do have to talk about the business side because the UFC basically implodes, and that creates an opportunity for all these other events all around the world and all over the U.S. to proliferate, and all kinds of fighters come out of that. Actually, I don't even know how this episode got in the plotline. It totally breaks the theme of the show. What's the big idea here?
I don't know. You approved it. That was your idea.
I don't read everything to the bottom. That's you're tricking me.
Well, we can listen. The last episode of this season's pending. We'll put it that way. Maybe we'll throw a curve on you. I don't know. We got that far that they start running into troubles. It's not over yet. We got the Dark Ages. We got it's going to be several years before we get to the Zuffa era. Let's put it that way.
Yes. And if you look at my old history, Kid Nate's MMA history on Bloody Elbow, we're going to talk about the rise of strikers, like people like Maurice Smith, who showed, and Igor Vovchanchin, who showed that striking kickboxing techniques definitely had a place in MMA. Once you learned a basic level of submission defense on the ground, eventually you probably get a chance to stand back up on your feet, and that was some of the most fun stuff. And then you also had, we'll talk about the reign of the wrestlers and guys like not just Dan Severn, but the wave of monsters, roided up monsters like Mark Kerr and Mark Coleman, who had real blue chip NCAA wrestling credentials and a whole lot of power.
And they also perfected the headbutt.
Yes, back in the day when you could headbutt. Yeah. And I'm still a little verklempt about the loss of the headbutt. I really think it's a legit
I mean, if you want MMA, I guess there's two parts of it. For some people, MMA should be purely a sport with it has no bearing on fighting, real life world fight. And other people, MMA is supposed to be a lab where you test fighting techniques.
Yeah.
And so if you're losing certain techniques, like, head kick or kicks to grounded opponents to the head, or knees to grounded opponents to the head, or
Or headbutts.
Or headbutts.
Remember when Roger Huerta got in the fight with the former Atlanta Falcon on the streets of Austin here in 2008 or 9?
Yeah.
It wasn't shown on video, but Huerta later talked about what the technique he used to drop the clown was a headbutt. And, I mean, the guy was literally twice Huerta's size.
Yeah.
But he just grabbed him by the shoulder.
He was a professional football middle linebacker. Those guys he's like 260 pounds at that time.
Yeah. I mean, this is a guy who's walking the streets thinking, nobody can mess with me because I'm me.
And then nothing better than a little pretty boy takes off his shirt. Oh, the model wants to fight me.
Yeah. And so, a little sad about the headbutts, but we'll talk about
Chris Dolman. That's the guy you're thinking of.
Chris Dolman, yes, from Holland, who
not the defensive end for the Minnesota Vikings. That's a different Chris Dolman. Yeah.
Who remembers Chris Dolman from the Minnesota Vikings?
He's a Hall of Famer, dude.
Is he?
Yeah, he had over 20 sacks one season. Led the league in.
What era is this?
This we're talking about late 80s, early 90s.
I didn't even watch football then, so it's all. Actually, I do vaguely remember that because I followed Troy Aikman and the Cowboys all the way to the end of that era. But I'm trying to hype the series here, John.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm distracting you.
We're going to talk about Carlson Gracie's incredible team. Conan. It's for a while like every Brazilian jiu-jitsu fighter in MMA. It seemed like they came out of Carlson Gracie's camp. We'll talk about the 90s boom and bust of Vale Tudo in Brazil, which ends. I think we'll definitely be talking about the fight promotion that ended in a literal riot when Renzo Gracie is fighting Eugenio Taddeo. How do you say his name? Eugene Taddeo?
I cannot pronounce any names of these people.
Yeah. So, but Luke Thomas will pronounce them correctly. If we can keep Luke Thomas, which is where you guys need to share and retweet and talk about this thing because we got to keep Luke Thomas interested.
Yeah, and if you don't like Luke Thomas, then you still want to share because he hates doing this. So
yes. So, and we'll talk about the Raw team, which is where Randy Couture and Dan Henderson and Matt Lindland get involved. The first Greco-Romans.
That's when we started introducing a lot of real athletes to the sport. I mean, Jackson was before. We had some other guys, but. That's big, and then I think we eventually we'll have to get to Pride and
we've got a ways to go there. We'll talk about the Lions Den. We'll talk about
skip ahead.
Luta Livre not ever making it. Luta Livre never produced a great champion. The closest they came was Babalu Sobral, and by that point, Jiu-Jitsu and Luta Livre had basically declared a peace treaty. And at this point in 2017, they're essentially the same thing. Like Jiu-Jitsu has absorbed Luta Livre.
Yeah, we got to, and they'll be good. We'll have to go back and cover how Luta Livre really is. It's catch can wrestling. That's what it really is. Old fashioned catch can.
And we'll go back and talk about the many. I mean, Luta Livre in Brazil had many great champions. There were periods when the best MMA fighter in Brazil in the 40s, again in the 60s, were Luta Livre guys.
And it's fascinating too. Their hostility to Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, especially the Gracie family, because part of it, Jorge Gracie or George Gracie in English. He left the family in a feud back and went and taught the Libre guys, the catch can wrestling guys. So there's all this intrigue in Brazil that involves this stuff.
And the Gracies then become trainers for the bodyguards of the dictator in the 60s. So they're associated with the military dictatorship. But then we'll get up to Kazushi Sakuraba and the apotheosis of Japanese catch wrestling dominating the sport. We'll talk about Frank Shamrock, one of the most underrated UFC fighters of all time. One of the
best guys to talk to. He's a really interesting dude.
Yeah, and so hopefully we'll be able to maybe get an interview with Frank. So anyway, if you like the sound of this kind of stuff, check out our first episode of Pan Chronicles. Tell your friends. And we're going to keep doing this, hopefully. So we're working on episode 2. We should have it very soon. From there, episode 3, 4. After 4 will come 5.
Yeah. And then we might throw a twist.
We might skip to 7 and then go.
We might switch it to French. It's got six.
No. This is all sad jokes. But anyway, that's the whole purpose of this little show. It's just a teaser for our Pan Chronicles series. Please check it out. We'll put links in this video when it goes up again. We'll do another post on Bloody Elbow with the Pan Chronicles episode embedded in it. Any final thoughts, John? Anything else you want to say?
That catch as catch can got hosed in the early days of MMA, and that the Gracie family was very fortunate that some better fighters didn't show up.
Yes, and I think the key thing was that they caught. It was kind of like the way Floyd Mayweather caught Canelo Alvarez early in his career.
Yeah,
if the Pancrase guys had another 3 to 5 years or another decade,
yeah,
it would have been a whole different.
Yeah, I mean, the one thing Pancrase guys had, and now we're in counterfactuals, and this is fascinating, is they had over, and this is not to take, I'm not going to be like anti-Gracie people, because there's some people that just despise the Gracie family and think they're frauds. I don't believe that at all. But what Pancrase had is they had a much bigger pool of athletes to draw from. Yeah. Where the Gracie family had these schools and a few guys there, Pancrase was out recruiting top fighters in other sports to come and participate in their pro wrestling. And if they would have gone real earlier, let's say in '86, they would have been recruiting kickboxers and American Greco-Roman wrestlers and freestyle wrestlers. There would have been a pool of really top athletes competing for real. And who knows, maybe Shamrock wouldn't have been the champion they sent there, or maybe Shamrock would be that much better because his competition would have been immense.
I don't think there was anything that ever would have made Ken Shamrock a really great champion. I mean, the guy's problems were in his head. Like, yeah,
he's I'm trying to compare who he is that just falls apart.
I mean, yeah.
When he really has to win, he just doesn't win.
No, he doesn't. I think that there's a quarterback for the Colts, wasn't there?
Manning, or is Knobloch from the Yankees after he threw that he missed one bad pitch to first base, and ever since he was ruined.
Yep.
There's just a clutch situation. He just wasn't there.
Anyway, so that's our show. We'll be doing a few more of these. Let us know if you think this was interesting. We might incorporate some interviews or something next time. So give us feedback on what you think of this little experiment. And then, there's the UFC next week, and we'll have all the shows. Subscribe, blah, blah, blah. Follow us on Twitter at KidNate, at Hey Not The Face, which I got to say, the worst Twitter handle.
Worse than Kid Nate. You're an adult man calling yourself a kid.
But I look like a kid.
Listen, Hey Not The Face is, I'm very honest about my fighting. No, I'm just, I'm very protective of this. This is the moneymaker. This is the moneymaker right here. I cover the beard and bad lighting in my studio here to hide the moneymaker.
If you love magical entertainment like this, subscribe to MMANation.com on YouTube. I don't think we're putting on this one on iTunes, but MMA Nation on iTunes, etc., etc. So thanks very much, John, and we'll see you next time. Adios, MMA aficionados.